Welcome to Well-Rounded. I'm your host, Tiffany Parker. Hello and welcome back to Well-Rounded. I hope you guys are having a fabulous week so far. So I'm very, very excited about this one. I have a guest on, and her name is Dr. Melissa Newberry. She was one of my professors at BYU, and I took her adolescent development class back when I did music education for a hot minute. It was my absolute favorite class. Even amongst all the religion classes and the music classes, actually, most of them were not that fun, to be honest. But yeah, I had to take a bunch of education related classes, and hers was my favorite. And so I'm so excited that she's been willing to come on and be on the podcast. I have all of my notes still, and I've been reading through them all week, so I'm super excited. Melissa, will you introduce yourself and tell us about you, what you teach at BYU, your studies, your interests, things like that?
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I was surprised to get your invitation, and it's been a while since we've seen each other, and I'm very, very flattered to hear that was your favorite class because I love it, but I don't know that all students always do. So it's good to hear. I have been teaching now at BYU for 16 years, and I'm just a small town girl from Southern Ohio and has really no idea how she got here, because I come from humble beginnings. Like my father barely graduated high school. My mother also just as a high school grad. My grandparents didn't graduate high school even. None of the four even went to high school. Wow. So being a first-generation student, coming to BYU, not knowing what I was doing, I really kind of fell into my position here, fell into graduate school, and then was recruited by BYU when I was still trying to find out what I was interested in. I was really passionate about it, but I really fell into it. So yeah, it's interesting to be at this position where students find what I was passionate about, something that they find so interesting. Even years after they graduate, they still hold on to the handouts that I created in class. Yeah. So that's quite nice to hear.
Awesome. And what other classes do you teach? Because I only took the one because I had to take a ton of music classes, and learn how to teach the music concepts and conduct and all that stuff. So what are some of the other classes that you teach?
Well, I teach two undergraduate classes. They're pretty similar. One is adolescent development, and the other one is adolescent development plus classroom management. Mm-hmm. So one's a 2-credit, one's a 3-credit. This year I'm actually teaching a section of the very new University 101 Foundations course that all new freshmen have to take. So that's been fun so far.
Interesting.
Other than that, I usually teach graduate courses, and it depends on the year. The graduate courses that I tend to teach are teacher development and mentoring, which I taught this past summer, and a class on social emotional learning, which I taught 2 summers ago. So those are courses I developed for our program, our Teacher Education Masters. And I occasionally get to teach a class on learning theories, but not as much, which is fine. I prefer to teach the social emotional learning class. I love teaching the teacher development class because my research is in teacher development, and specifically with relationships and emotions that are in the schools and how teachers navigate those between students and other faculty within the schools. So those are my interests. So I like teaching those classes.
Nice. Yeah, I looked up your profile or whatever on BYU's website, and it said you have an interest in, what did it say? Emotion regulation.
Emotion regulation. Yeah, emotion regulation is where I started, actually. If you want to hear a fun story, this is
Yes,
how I got
please.
into when I was sent off to graduate school, I didn't know what I was going to study. I didn't know why I was going to graduate school, really. I just had a faculty member I met serendipitously say, you should do this for a living. And I didn't know what it meant, really. But I happened to go back. She told me I should go meet with somebody at Ohio State by the name of Anita Hoy, Anita Wolfolk-Hoy, she's a very well-known name in educational psychology. She wrote the main textbooks. So I went out. I happened to have a ticket to Columbus anyway because I was going home to visit my family. And I met with her, but when I was down visiting my family, my then 8-year-old nephew came in from school that day, and he was kind of down in the dumps. And we just were asking him, well, hey, what's going on? What's wrong? And he said, oh, it's my teacher hates me. And we were both kind of shocked. His mother and I were both shocked. And we're like, well, I'll try to convince him that wasn't true and talk him out of it. And he said, no, I know she does because she's always yelling at me and I get in trouble a lot, but it's okay. She probably has a pretty hard life. And that just broke my heart to think here's this 8-year-old boy seems to have a higher emotional intelligence than his teacher did, to be able to say, I forgive you, even though you yell at me, your life must be hard. Whereas she could have done the same thing to him, right? He's always out of his seat helping other kids. Well, maybe he has attention deficit. Maybe he has, other things rather than just yelling at him. So that actually is why I got into teacher emotion regulation, because heaven knows it's easy to love people who love you back. But when I started talking to teachers before I went to graduate school, how hard is it to deal with kids? And some of them said, well, you can't love them all. And that surprised me because I thought, oh no, is my nephew one of those that you can't love? Why would you go into teaching if you couldn't love all the children? But I personally didn't go into teaching for that reason, right? I'm I don't know if I could love everybody. Mm-hmm. So I didn't go into teaching for that reason, to find out that other teachers struggled with that. That was my interest. So I'm how do you love people who don't love you back? How do you do that? And I found the writings of Nell Noddings and the teacher Care, and that just got me really fascinated into ideas of how do we regulate, when do we regulate, why do we regulate, when is it appropriate to regulate, what does that look like, how do we choose to do so. Mm-hmm. So that's where I started emotion regulation.
Nice. That's awesome. How do you feel like emotion regulation abilities or competency has changed over the years? So obviously society is very different now, and I think social media is bigger than it's ever been. Have you noticed that that's made a difference?
I feel that society plays on emotions. They become monetized on social media, and because the more likes you get, right? So the more you can evoke emotion, strong emotion, the more likes you can get. Whether that's if you're getting somebody riled up negatively, you can get more reaction, or you can rile them up for positive reasons. But it's easier to get somebody upset about something than it is to get them all super hyped about something they love. But people are monetizing emotions on social media, and I find that very disturbing, actually.
Oh, really?
Well, emotional manipulation is typically a bad thing in relationships. Mm-hmm. Right? Gaslighting is emotionally manipulating people. Mm-hmm. Rather than honoring other people's emotions and how they feel, if we're telling people how they should feel, shaming them for the way they actually do feel, trying to convince them they don't feel what they actually feel, that's not healthy for any relationship, right? People need to be authentic, because emotions are... So I've done some work with a colleague in Australia who's now recently retired last year, by the name of Phil Riley. And the two of us talked a lot about this idea that emotions, as we know, in the field of emotions is emotions are just information. And if we ignore that information, then we're not making the best decisions, because the more information we have, the better decisions we make. And emotions as information allow us to make good decisions. So I actually just did a presentation for a local ward, a stake actually meeting, a Relief Society meeting, in which they wanted to know about emotions. And so my take on emotions, and it's not just my take, this is popular opinion in the emotions world, that it's a false dichotomy to say logic versus emotion. That you can't have a thought without an emotion, you can't have an emotion without a thought. They originate in the same part of the brain. They are both very important to decision making. And if we favor one over the other, it's a disservice to ourselves if we say, oh, no, I'm being too emotional, I just need to think about this logically. Don't allow my emotions to bleed in at all. But then on the opposite side, to say my logic is too much here, like I feel this and this is I feel it so strongly, it must be right. You've got to have a balance. And so neither is correct, the stoic or the hysteric. Both of them are not as healthy as they could be if they recognize alignment of head and heart is really important for good decision making.
Nice. I love that you said that, alignment of head and heart. I've been looking into that a lot recently. How would you suggest people combat kind of that dichotomy there and try and get the head and the heart to be more in tune and balanced with each other? Do you have any suggestions for that?
I think the problem that most people have, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself, honestly, people are fearful of emotions, I think, in general. There are scary emotions. If you've been raised by a parent who has anger issues, right, then emotions seem very scary. Or if you have trauma of some kind, that fear that's overwhelming, that's very scary. And so we often think about strong emotions as negative and bad emotions. We don't always think about being overwhelmed with joy, right? We think about being overwhelmed with fear and anger and sadness. But I find that a lot of people have difficulty identifying the emotions that they actually feel. And some of the research indicates that people know the big four. If you watch Inside Out, right?
Yeah.
Those are the four emotions that everyone has, right? And those are the only ones that people, what are you feeling? I'm scared, I'm disgusted, I'm happy, I'm angry. But most people just say, well, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm fine. Well, fine's not an emotion. But if you were to ask them again, what, well, okay, you're fine, but what are you feeling right now? It might take them a moment. And so there are tools out there that are helpful. There are some apps, there's an app that I introduced to students in a class last year by Mark Brackett called How We Feel. And it uses color. It's part of his program that he takes to schools to help them learn. It's called the ruler system for teaching social emotional learning. It helps people, there are 4 quadrants, and they're color quadrants. And then within those color quadrants, you can see high emotion, red, and high emotion, yellow. But they're calm ones versus, intense ones. And so once you kind of get into that, and then they give you suggestions what is the emotion? So they have a bunch of emotion words, and then you can kind of identify. A therapist will do something like that too. They have emotion wheels.
Yeah. And
so you can go around till you find their emotion that really hits, right? It sounds like it might be the right one until oh wait, yes, I'm feeling melancholy, that's what I feel, right? But you didn't know the word for it, or you didn't actually know what you were feeling because you're not practiced in identifying the emotion you're actually feeling.
Interesting.
So,
nice. So you mentioned that this emotional manipulation that we're kind of going through right now, that everyone is kind of forced to participate in almost, unless you just stay off socials altogether, which is hard, right? And you said how it's bad for relationships. Is that in your opinion, do you think that's why people are so lonely nowadays, and why people are um, having a hard time getting married or finding a significant other?
That's a good question. I think there's something to that. Yeah, I do believe that very few of us, speaking as a single woman, I'll say that my experience has been when I meet men who haven't been married have never been married, it feels like they have lost hope, I guess, that it's a possibility. And the longer they remain single, as their friends marry off, they have less emotional partners. And men in general have less emotional partners. Most men, their relationships aren't based on emotional support. Their relationships are based on shared activity often. And they assume emotional support in it, and they can get it, but they usually only get it from one source. And I find that with divorced men too. I have a theory that the reason divorced men marry faster than divorced women is because divorced men had their wife as their emotional support. When they left their mother's home, right, they had maybe their mothers and their sisters, but once they left that home and married, their emotional support person was their spouse. And then once that divorce happens, they don't have emotional support. Where the females, they have a lot of emotional support in their female friends, their sisters, their mothers, all the women in their lives. So once they divorce, they still have the emotional support. Where the men have to go searching, they need to go find it. And so they marry a lot faster, finding a woman who would be their emotional support system again. And so if you have someone who's been alone for a long time, those feelings of loneliness probably increase. I would suggest that I would suppose they could, because the longer you're alone and the more your friends marry off, it's harder to find confidants because it takes a while to make friendships again. And I mean, it's even hard just to find who you might be friendly with people at work when you're past 30 years old and all your friends are getting married and they're forming their emotional attachments in their family systems. And that leaves very few of you at the office. And even if you knew them, doesn't mean you have a lot in common just because you work together. So finding someone who can be that emotional confidant is more difficult to do as you age. So it probably does. And so people go searching. I think I read somewhere, where did I see this recently? That somebody suggested like the extreme right, like the MAGA movement is people looking for a place to emote and be accepted in those emotions. And no matter how extreme they are, right? Because if you find someone who has the extreme feelings that you're having, like, there are my people, right? And so finding those online spaces where it's acceptable to say all the deep, dark things that you, before in polite company, aren't supposed to say, gives people a space to share everything, And is that healthy? That they're sharing it with everybody, right? Not necessarily.
Yeah, totally. That's interesting. Yeah, how would you say, you kind of brought up politics and how that's kind of like a search for connection. Do you feel like that's maybe why we're so, I mean, it's an election year, so, but do you feel like that's maybe why we're so politically divided right now, or at least a contributing factor, at least?
Definitely a contributing factor. I can't say that's the number one reason that we're divided, but definitely it contributes because when we are trying to find our people, right, a lot of that has to do where we feel comfortable and where we feel belonging and where we feel accepted, because we crave that. That's part of connecting with someone else. We can't connect with people who are constantly judging us for our feelings, right? And so if we have somebody who is open to what we say, and then we're accepting what, yeah, it just feeds that need to belong, right? And even so, you can kind of go down, spiral down, just because I feel accepted. And that actually comes out in cults. It comes out, and right, there are other situations like that too. It's that belonging piece that, like, my needs are known and I feel accepted. It has a lot of emotional reasons for joining cults, and emotional reasons for staying in abusive relationships, and emotional reasons for a lot of the risky behaviors that we might participate in.
Interesting. Oh, that's so cool. This stuff is so cool. It's also stressful, but
and stress is just an emotion,
yeah.
and it will pass like all other emotions.
Yeah. So without saying anything too personal, could you share some of the things you're observing with those emotions and people being maybe really emotional or overly emotional or underly emotional? I feel like I teach and coach a bunch of students right now, and I feel like I've noticed a lot of the kind of rising generation, they seem to be a little bit more anxious, or they seem to be a little bit more, I don't know if stressed is the right word, but they just seem a little bit more like sensitive or something like that. Can you talk about that at all? Have you noticed that yourself? Or
Oh, definitely. We've seen anxiety increase on campus a lot, especially since COVID. COVID was such an interesting time because right there in the middle of adolescence for our current students, right? They were in high school, where it's really important time for belonging. Really important time for making those relationship connections. They're seeking identity development, and they have seeking like intimacy at that time, and they were not able to get that. They were excluded, they were separated, they were cut off from opportunities. And so when they did have opportunities to connect, it was through social media. And so that, I think, made it worse, because the anxiety of, did they see my post? Was it good enough? No, not enough people liked it. And then the comparison, of course, the comparison culture. But the problem with social media and all the different things on media, even like video games, like the little dopamine hits, the design of these games, the design of these apps, the design, like TikTok and all that stuff, they're designed, and we know this, people who design them have been open about it, they're designed to keep your attention for a long time. And the way they do that is manipulate your emotions through dopamine hits, right? And so even if I'm in a room now with a bunch of other people, sitting here silently waiting for someone to approach me, I don't get a dopamine hit.
right.
Picking up my phone, chatting with somebody across the world, even them liking my comment, them not even, I don't even know who it is, and it doesn't really matter. Just to know that somebody somewhere, that's a dopamine hit, right? So whether it's playing a game online with somebody else who's paying attention to you, right, because they have to interact. Or if it's just, somebody upvoting your comment, that produces that dopamine hit that you may not get sitting silently next to somebody waiting for them to be the first one to speak, right? Or if you are brave enough to speak and that person you happen to say something to is taken off guard and they don't know how to respond because it's been so long that since they've practiced interaction, that it can feel like rejection. And so it's safer online, because I don't know how many people saw my comment and didn't comment, didn't like it. But I do know if I'm sitting next to somebody and I say hi and they turn away from me, or if they don't smile back, right? So I can't ignore the rejection in the room, but I can ignore the rejection online, right? Because some of the things, I mean, if they don't upvote me, I don't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them have even taken down the thumbs down, right? And so you don't know how many people are ignoring it or, not giving it much credence, but it feels safer online. And safety, I don't know if I said this in your class, but I try to say it in every class, right? The 3 needs everyone has, and they're all trying to meet: safety, esteem, and belonging. And so it's safer to do something where you don't know what the risks really are. Right? So.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I love that you brought up COVID, because it's been such a interesting study, but also kind of a tragic one a little bit. And I feel like, I mean, it affected me, it affected everybody, right? But I think I was 26, 27 by that point, or 25 or something like that. And I was pretty much done with school almost. I graduated in 2021, finally. But I still even got like an online graduation ceremony, whereas people in 2020 didn't even get that. It was like, well, send your paper in the mail. Great, or whatever.
Right, and imagine if you had been in high school, because a lot of college kids, like, I'm not even going to pay for it. I don't want to walk. It's too expensive. But high school, like, that is one of the defining elements of your, say, hey, you're an adult now. We are celebrating your walk across the stage from a child to an adult.
Right.
And if you don't get that, they are just kind of lost as far as just the connection, just the acknowledgement. It was a big part of their adolescent loss.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I have noticed some of that stuff in my voice students too, because I also, so I teach, I'm not like a professor in a classroom or anything, but I coach students on the job with like our sound stuff and whatnot, and then I teach private voice lessons as well. And so it's been interesting to see how COVID's affected socialization. And even when I just ask them at the beginning of a lesson, how was your week? It's fine.
Right.
And I'm like, okay.
But that's not atypical.
Right.
That's actually not atypical for many adolescents, right, to be short answered. And we have to think about that as adults, like, what kind of questions can we ask that actually elicit a response, a true engagement response, rather than just a one-word response.
Yeah.
And that's why I try to talk to teachers about, like, our questions shouldn't be, you need to engage them in questions, that can be more specific, and they can actually answer them with thought rather than just, a pattern.
Right. Totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
And okay.
Yeah, with the like board tone or whatever. Yeah. Totally. That's cool. Okay, I want to backtrack a little bit to something you said about this dopamine hit in the brain, because I think it's really kind of affecting everything. Have you noticed, would you say that I feel like I know a lot of people more so, or I guess I'm just meeting a lot more people who claim to have ADD or claim to have ADHD, or they haven't gotten officially diagnosed, but they kind of self-diagnose or something. Do you think that more people actually are developing those attention deficit disorders? Or do you think that they just haven't, because of TikTok? I think TikTok, in my opinion, has been especially bad, more than some of the others, just because it's like 6 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever. Would you say that more people are actually developing attention deficit disorder, or they just haven't been forced to focus?
Okay, I'm not an expert on this, but
Okay.
I would love to advertise for a book I read recently.
Okay.
Fascinating. I actually heard him speak on a different podcast, and then I ran out and read his book, and it's literally this thick.
Really?
Okay? It is literally this thick, but it reads really, really well. It's very fast read. The book is called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, who is a physician. And he makes the claim in there that anxiety and ADHD, neither one of them have any biological markers. So there are no biological reasons that we can find genetically that people have anxiety or ADHD. So, however, we're treating them as if they are a biological, physiological symptom. And so people are given Ritalin or they're given other things to try to like control this. But why? And in that book, he puts forth his theory that, and I buy into it because of my background probably, so my bias from my own research. His theory is the social conventions that we have created over these last decades in which we have altered the family system so that attachment is not secure. So, for example, if you know anything about attachment theory, right? So, briefly, attachment theory states the first 2 years of a child's life are super important, like first 2 to 3 years. And they create attachments with their primary caregiver that tell them whether or not the world is safe, right? So you have secure attachment or insecure attachment. Your insecure attachments, when you talk about adult attachment theory, they're still like anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, disorganized attachment, right? So, but basically what it boils down to, if I feel there is, if I have a secure base as a child, like I have a loving, secure adult that when I fear, I can go right back and they will comfort. If I have a need, they will meet it, right? And so that fear is decreased in their mind, and they develop this worldview that the world is a safe place. Okay. According to what Dr. Mate is saying, when we take people away from the children too early in their lives, like think of how many generations women have been in the workforce, or both parents are working, and so children are from 6 months old are put in daycare with 15 other children. And so the attachments that they're creating are insecure attachments. And these insecure attachments then raise the level of anxiety. Then over these decades, right, what do you have? You have insecure people marrying other insecure people, creating insecure families. Also, probably more divorces are happening, because he doesn't say the divorce rate, but it's not a hard leap over to say, well, these people who are struggling to be attached in healthy ways, if they didn't resolve that before they got married, yeah, it could contribute to the divorce rate. And so you have these parents raising children who also have then their attachment issues. And maybe even, generational traumas contribute to that too. And so what do you have? Then you have a pandemic, and that just exacerbates the problem already. And so yes, these kids were already probably more anxious than their parents were because of the way that they have been raised. And then just multiply that with the other social things that are happening with that. The amount of violence in the world, the amount of fear-based rhetoric, the amount of all the things that are really hyping those uncomfortable feelings rather than bolstering the comfortable feelings. And so if you have that, you're going to have higher ADHD, because what is that really? That's like watching for signs and signals of safety. It could be interpreted that way. Like I said, I'm not an expert on ADHD, but when I read that book, it made so much sense to me. Of course, I'm biased because of my own research and my belief in attachment theory. So I just recommend to you and your listeners to read that book. There are some things at the end, like he talks about ayahuasca journeys and stuff like that to help people. And I don't know enough about that to say, well, actually he's very careful to say not everybody should go on an ayahuasca trip.
I don't even know what that is. What is that?
It's kind of like, have you heard of peyote?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, some Native American tribes, actually Native South American tribes in Peru, there are these shaman who will take you on ayahuasca journey. So it's a naturally occurring herb, but it's also a psychedelic.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So these are psychedelic trips, basically.
Got it.
Right. Which put you in almost an outer body experience, but brings clarity to your experience by removing you somewhat from your experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So you can almost look at yourself from a third person perspective and recognize the things that you're doing that bring trouble, I suppose.
Yeah.
But he does say advocate like those need to be done in special circumstances with trained professionals and not just
Some witch doctor or whatever.
not just tripping balls just because you want to, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I wrote that down, so I will go look that up because that's super interesting to me. You talked about family relationships and things like that. Have you noticed a shift in? I feel like, and maybe things are just a little bit hyper dramatized online and stuff, but I feel like shocking, right? But I feel like maybe families are not as encouraged as much, or it's hard to kind of, because obviously I'm in the church where family's everything, right? But I feel like I am seeing a lot more broken families or things like that. How does that kind of affect upbringing in that way, or what have you noticed through your research or just experience?
Well, divorce rates in the church are almost at the same rate of non-members.
Really?
Now, yeah.
Interesting.
And so that is a concern, of course. But I think there are a lot of factors in that. I mean, again, society has glamorized that dysfunctional family. Right, we have the secret lives of all these types of housewives, right? Even there are two that focus on secret lives of Mormon housewives, right? And which
I actually did an episode about that show. I watched it all the way through. It was very interesting.
Yeah. But it's highly dysfunctional, right? Highly dysfunctional, but it feeds on, again, the emotion and uncomfortable emotions. Now, is it normalizing that this is what this families should look like? I don't know, like, because in one way it may be people are like, those are the crazy people, right? Mm-hmm. But it is normalizing hanging everything out there, right? And doing this for attention, right? And so who gets famous? The more extreme you are, the better your chances are of getting famous, right? The more absurd things you say. I mean, TikTok is full of just crazy attempts to be seen, right? And they are driven by that need for a dopamine hit, right? So if you have somebody the more risk you take, often the more risk you need to get your serotonin to calm yourself back down. So if you start doing this in adolescence, then that risk increases. So what does that look like for relationships and families? How long before I get bored with this relationship, right? What does it mean to be content in a relationship if I've only sought the thrill of that emotional spike, that roller coaster? If I think that's what family should be like because that's what my family has been like, unless I'm exposed to a more stable, secure experience, and you can find those, you can have reattachment or healthy attachment experiences outside of the family that clue you into like, oh wait, maybe the drama wasn't the best way to do it. But people don't usually know what they don't know, right? And so it is, I mean, that's what I think university life is really great for, because it exposes you to a lot of different people, especially when you're thrown into a roommate situation. You know, you got 6 different families coming together, and you're like, how did your family do it? And which one seemed like the healthiest, right? But individually, you get to choose, right? And normal is usually what we gravitate towards, but sometimes normal was unhealthy. And so we still gravitate towards that because it gives us a sense of safety because it's what we've known, even then when it's not actually safe, right? So abusive people who end up in people who have been abused end up in abusive relationships. Is that healthy? No. Was it normal for them? Yes. And so how do you break that cycle? Something has to happen to bring you to a knowledge of a different way of being. And hopefully that can be through exposure. I try to help my teacher candidates say, you know, you could be that secure person in the life of a child who doesn't have secure attachments, whose home life is unstable. But they can't do that if they themselves aren't stable, right? So right now that is kind of a tricky thing because I do see students in my classrooms and I'm like, oh, let's work through some of your trauma in this semester before you go out there and like become re-traumatized when you meet a student who reminds you of your experience. But I only have a semester, so there's not so much I can do, right? I can expose them to these ideals, and they can take them up or they can't, right? They can ignore them just as much as they can like buy into them. And some of them buy into them, and some of them like, oh my gosh, it's so helpful. Like I've learned so much about myself. And some of them are like, that's a bunch of crock, and I don't need you doing therapy with me in class, right? Which I don't try to do therapy with students. I just introduce them to ideals about, you know, what healthy could look like, and ideals about how to best support the development of intimacy and identity and autonomy in these adolescents so that they can be their healthy best self. But it's, you win some, you lose some.
Yeah,
right?
Totally. Yeah, you're doing the Lord's work over there.
I'm trying, but I tell you what, I'm also have to continue to work on myself all the time
Right.
too, because like, you know, I'm human. So
And that's okay.
yeah, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So some days I do a good job of like being that secure attachment for a student in my class, and sometimes I didn't get enough sleep.
Yeah, totally. I find it interesting what you talked about with the attachment and being that safe space as a teacher. How do you draw the line between being that student's representation of what normal or safe, like healthy normal can look like, while also having a boundary? Because I know I've encountered directors or teachers who kind of blurred that boundary, and then things kind of blew up, you know? So how do you kind of maintain that representation of like, you could be safe and in a normal, healthy situation while not like breaking a boundary, you know?
Yeah, I think that goes back a little bit to that self-awareness stuff with, you know, identifying your emotions. And that doesn't happen easily if you're not a person who has done it. I'll admit, like, I thought I was really great at emotion regulation. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to study why everybody else can't do this. But what I learned about myself, because I'm pretty stoic, and I don't know, you've had my class. I don't remember what year I started to do this. So did I introduce the class with showing you my own adolescent pictures? Do you remember that?
I think so.
Yeah, because I started doing that because I have a blank affect. And so if I'm not engaged in conversation, like maybe your viewers who people are actually seeing this instead of listening to it will say like, well, she's actually pretty expressive.
Yeah.
But I have RBF.
Me too.
I've had it for a long time. Right? But that comes from actually some down that's some trauma down the line, right? So where you learn not to express because that kept you safe, that kept you from being picked on, that kept you from being a target. And so that blank affect, I thought, made it that I was regulating my emotions so well. And then I went to a therapy once, and my therapist said, you don't feel your emotions, you think your emotions. And that struck me so deeply because I'm like, oh, she's right. Like, if you ask me how I feel, I will tell you how I think. And I will explain and analyze, but I don't necessarily emote unless I know it's safe and secure. So I think a lot of people may do that. And so the only way that you can honestly regulate your emotion is if you can honestly identify your emotion. And that requires you to be very self-aware. So recently, actually, I guess about 8 years ago, I started to take up mindfulness practice in earnest. I kind of dabbled with it for like the last 20 years, but I couldn't seem to get it to stick. So about 8 years ago, I think it is now, they offered a course here on campus for faculty with a mindfulness trainer named Thomas McConkie. And I learned a little bit more about how mindfulness works and how to practice it. And so met with him over the years. You know, he held a course yearly on this campus for 8 years. He's now off at Harvard at Divinity School, so he's not around to give us more. But I actually became certified mindfulness instructor last year. And I have attempted to incorporate that into my classes and also offer small courses for students. It's not an enrolled for credit class, but just like during the semester, a 4-week course on mindfulness to help them start to be aware of their own experience. Because I find that our busy brains keep us from actually noticing how we are feeling. And maybe sometimes our brains will talk us out of how we're feeling. And we will if we don't calm down enough, it's like praying, and then there's like, you're okay, I need all these things, list all the things I want in my prayer, and then you get up and leave the door, but you never stop to hear if there was an answer. Same thing is with our lives. Like, well, what am I feeling right now? I don't know. I'm anxious. I'm upset. I'm like, oh, I got so much to do. I don't have time to sit and think. Well, if you don't take that time to sit and think, you don't know actually why you're anxious. You don't actually know what's really stressing you. And is this something that you need to worry about or not? So for me, COVID was a wonderful time to practice this in earnest because I had all the time in the world to just sit and think about how I'm feeling in the moment and what things I had control of and what things I didn't have control of, and understanding where boundaries could be in place and why they should be in place, and recognizing how setting boundaries actually protects people from me as well as protects me from them. Because, people who don't know themselves well enough may also be overreaching and trying to do for others, right? And so knowing yourself, setting boundaries, getting more aware of your alignment between your values and your actions will result in appropriate emotion regulation.
Nice. That's awesome.
That's what I believe.
Yeah, no, that's great. I actually had a mindset coach a couple of years ago, and it's very interesting. And I wish I had that as a student. That would have helped a lot.
Did you do mindfulness practices? Like you learned some breathing regulation and stuff like that? Okay.
Yeah. And figuring out what we worked on, because it was from a career standpoint. So I'm a performer first, and I love being on stage. I love being in front of people, but in especially the theater world, performance world, there's a lot of rejection. You put yourself, and you have to be vulnerable. You're putting yourself out there. You're being in front of people. And I'm comfortable in front of people, but you have to be a character, and sometimes that character, you have to, if you don't relate to it personally, you have to find something personal, and then you kind of have to lay that bare through a song, where you have to not only act and sing, but you also have to make it
Emote.
yeah, you have to emote, and you have to make it
Right.
sincere too, right? Like, good acting is not being over dramatic or whatever.
Authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Authenticity comes into anything that you do. Like if it's well received, it's typically well received because it's authentic, right? People can it resonates with people,
Right.
and it usually has to resonate with you first before you can portray that.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. And so it's super hard mentally, and a lot of people are like, "Oh, that's so fun." And it's like, actually it's not sometimes, And so I was struggling with some burnout big time. Because it's like you put in a ton of work. Like, I'm the kind of person who's all about doing the work, the research, practicing. Like, I practice all the live long day, and then you get your 15 seconds to like show your authentic self and have good technique and show you're good to work with and like all these things, and then you get no, and you get no and no and no, and or you make it to callbacks and you spend a 6-hour day singing, dancing, working with different partners, all these things, and then you still get told no, so
Yeah.
so yeah, that's kind of what we worked on, is kind of fighting burnout and finding your
Yeah.
why of why I still want to do this stuff, and it was very eye-opening to me. It's like, oh, I don't have to just play the numbers game and just audition for everything and anything and everything. I can audition for something that I'm excited about, and
Yeah, 'cause it can be very emotionally taxing to try to produce emotions that you don't have.
right.
And so some of these teachers, my research is full of that, where that emotional labor that they perform in trying to, get excited about things that are like mundane so that they can teach them and the students will be excited about it, but also regulating their emotion, like down-regulating emotion or suppressing emotion. Those are very emotionally taxing practices that can lead to burnout, because if you can't be authentic, so trying to find that emotion regulation where, the cognitive reappraisal, what the technical term is, when you can do that, it's much more healthy when you can actually reappraise the situation, and then the emotion will be more authentic because you're reevaluating how you see it. You're aligned. And so, but if you're not doing that, if you're suppressing, or if you're downplaying or upregulating or downregulating your emotion, it becomes very emotionally taxing. At the end of the day, you're just spent.
Yeah.
Because it takes energy to do that.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of us in the School of Music too, like, kind of felt, and a lot of my other performance friends. So I did music education for about 3 years, and then switched my major to contemporary voice performance. And so I had a lot of friends who, commercial music, vocal performance, or music ed too, who they were like, at the end of the day, I don't even know why I sing anymore, because I was a vocalist major. So they're like, I don't even know, like, I don't even like music anymore. And and I actually was very grateful for my college experience, because it's a little bit weird. It's a little unique, because I didn't actually get into the degree that I wanted when I was a freshman in high school. I didn't get into it. And so then I, pivoted to music ed, and then I just ended up creating my major. And so I'm super grateful that I didn't ever feel that way, because I kind of got to custom make some things, and my major and my minor and stuff like that. But yeah, a lot of people kind of in my circles felt like, I don't know why I do music anymore. I don't enjoy it anymore. I'm exhausted, overworked, stressed, all those things, So
Yeah, your experience was unique in that when your efforts in this area didn't pan out, you were able to created your own little niche, and that supported your development, supported your feeling of efficacy, right? And so that's one of those needs that was met. Like, oh, I'm capable. I can do this. Like, look at this. People valued what I was doing. They thought there was this interesting thing, and look what they were able to do for me so that I could succeed. That's just, validating, right?
Yeah.
Validating all the emotions that you had about yourself and all the beliefs that you had about yourself were in that moment, solidified.
Yeah, and it was so nice too, because I'm one of the few people I know, at least, that still actually has a career in music. Like I get paid to do it, and then I declared a minor, and I get paid to do that, and a lot of people, a shocking amount of people, don't use what they learned in college, and that's that, and I think that's kind of led to why, like, oh, college is not worth it anymore.
Right, you got to learn to pivot. Like my undergrad is in Spanish.
No way.
yeah, it is. My undergraduate degree is a Spanish degree.
That's amazing.
And, of course, huge pivot. I did use my Spanish.
Right.
In my first career in government, I did a lot of working with the Latino population. And so I did use my language skills, but I didn't need a degree in it, I guess. But not knowing what to do, like pivot, and then finally you're out of here, and you've got to be open. And I think that actually goes with the whole idea of our emotions too, because we get so trapped in what we think we should be doing, how we feel that we are behind, or we feel that we're lost, and we feel that we're hopeless because things didn't work out the way we thought they would. And so those feelings can trap us if we're not, if we don't have the opportunity or the know-how to learn to be more open to experience and more, have that disposition, I guess, the disposition of willingness to try things. But that goes back to fear, right? And so a lot of those things, right, they're connected. All these ideas, right? Ideas and thoughts are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. And so you have these ideas, and then like the fear kicks in, like what if I fail? And so what if this is a waste of time? And I'll just share this wonderful tidbit I got from Thomas McConkie. Actually, it wasn't his saying, but one of his teachers shared with him that there are no problems to be solved, just experiences to be had. And so I try to think about that a lot. I try to help my students think about that because, we bump up into problems. The things don't work out, right? And if we are so sure that this is just indicating I'm not good, and then I can get stuck feeling worthless or hopeless, or like, there's no next steps, then, that doesn't lead to anything positive. But if I can learn to be mindful about what I can control, and that includes actually how I feel, then I can make some different choices about being open to, what if I fail? Well, what's going to happen if I fail? What's the worst that can happen, right? And people say that a lot, like, what's the worst that can happen? And if we can be open to answering that question and be okay that, oh, well, some humiliation, some embarrassment, and that's not the end of the world.
Right.
But I don't think our current culture helps people to think that, like, failure is, end all, be all, like, goodbye, you'll be canceled, you'll be, lots of things, and you'll be humiliated, and you can never show your face ever again.
Yeah.
But that, again, is emotional manipulation.
Right. Yeah, I feel like far too many things are way too serious.
Right.
And I have to remind myself that, because I very much, if someone is kind of anxious, or if they're angry, or if they're calm or whatever, like, it affects me. And so sometimes I get these professors who are maybe a little bit stressed or whatever, and they want their event to go super well, and it's our job to make it sound good and all this stuff, and
suddenly their problem becomes your problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And I totally get it, and it's nothing on them, but then I have to really, really regulate myself to not be like as well, because like that's going to make the student feel that way, and it's going to
and it's not going to help their performance.
Right.
A little bit of stress can help performance, But anxiety is not going to help their performance, right?
Yeah.
Like,
And it's not going to help you think clearly either.
no, too much anxiety, too much stress actually can kill brain cells. So we don't want that to happen, and we don't want that fear to overwhelm. We want them to get that excited nervousness, not like the anxious, scared nervousness,
Yeah.
right? And so that excited nervousness, that excited anxiousness versus anxiety,
Right.
I'm very anxious for this wonderful performance I have the opportunity to do, rather than that anxiety that all of this, if it doesn't go well, it's all my fault.
Right.
And if I don't succeed, the future is bleak.
Right.
And I think that's something, I don't know exactly why that happened in COVID, but it seems like there's a lot more of that in my students. The perfectionism never went away. My students tend to be perfectionists. Teachers in general, people who go into teaching,
Yeah.
have been really good at like checking off boxes, and they got high praise for doing things well. And so they tend to be perfectionists to start with. And then add on to that, like all the things they think they should be doing, all the things that they're now in our society, the demands we have on students to perform in everything, not just find one thing that you love, but like play the sport and the music and the, band and the clubs and the pageants and all the things that we want them to participate in, so that we can, I maybe say this naively because I don't have children, but as a parent, I think a lot of parents project on their children. Like, this will show the world that I'm a good parent if you succeed in all. The more things you succeed in, the better parent I am. And that stress is a lot for a child.
Yeah. Totally.
But that is because those parents were probably raised also in anxious homes where they had to like perform and they had to do, and every generation wants to outdo the previous generation. And most generations do outdo the previous generation just by the fact that we have more advantages in the world. But the pressure doesn't seem to go away with each new generation. It seems like
It's getting worse.
in the last few decades, it does seem like, you have all these opportunities, like you should take advantage of every one of them. And to the extent, right? So there's a lot of pressure on young adults. There's a lot of pressure on them to, and then of course they have the additional pressure of like finding a mate and making sure that they find the right person and that they are the right person, and then having those children, and they should be perfect little angels, and right, without being taught any of the things, and they should actually just start all over. They start over at ground zero, but for some reason they don't think they should. They think, I see this in a lot of students. I saw it as a student myself, a lot of my peers thinking like, well, we should have the big screen TVs. We can have the nice furniture, like, as soon as you're married. And like, who told you that? Like, you can't afford that. Like, stop going into debt so you can have all of the equipment, all of the toys, all of the whatever. So there's some of that too, where students know, maybe they know they're never going to afford a home, so they just gather other things, right? So they're spending it on things, luxuries that their parents have by the time they were teenagers. They don't realize that their parents didn't have when they were infants.
Yeah, my parents talk about, I wasn't born yet, but my parents talk about their rental from hell was in between houses or whatever, and how it was falling apart all the time. So,
and social media probably contributes to that, where you see the rich and famous being younger and younger, like these YouTube stars, right? Teenagers, children even, who are YouTube stars making millions of dollars, and what? I'm a chump trying to get through college and living, hand to mouth. So some of that probably is influenced by social media and the emotions that are being manipulated through that, because it makes it look really easy.
Yeah.
And it is kind of a 1 in a million kind of thing. Like, why do the algorithms turn people on to some podcasts and not others, you know?
Right. Yeah, no, and I feel a constant myself as I'm trying. I just recently launched my website for my voice teaching business. I was teaching at a studio in Provo, and then I left because it was time and I needed more money. And I've been teaching for like 11 years now, but and it's been so hard. And my episode actually came out yesterday. I talked about how it's just really uncomfortable trying to do the social media marketing thing, and how I'm trying really hard, and like it's a little embarrassing. So I kind of just like laid all that out and stuff, you know, and talked about kind of some of that mindset work that is kind of helping it through. And yeah, it's kind of hard to compare people's, or hard not to compare people's like now to where they started. And so something I've kind of been going through the last week is they didn't get this overnight. You know, most people don't get it overnight. If you're seeing or following them now or seeing that success now, it's taken them 5, 6, 7 years to get to that point, you know? And I feel like social media kind of shortens that to yesterday,
Right.
you know?
Right. It makes it look like the time span is, I mean, because people's memories are so poor to think back, you know, because if you think, when was COVID? That was 4 years ago, but it seems like yesterday,
Yeah.
right? Because it just, in our memories, that's something about emotions too. Like, the stronger the emotion, the more likely it is to be stored as memory, right? And so that tragic experience that you had during COVID is like lodged in there, probably stronger than the happy moments, you know, since. And so, because there's research out there that says that strong emotions is strong. Say this again, say it correctly. Bad emotion is stronger than good. Because my theory on that is because we have to process the bad. And we think through the bad, we ruminate on the bad because we're trying to make sense of it and trying to come back to equilibrium and figure out what went wrong, that we do so much processing that it's there in the brain deeper, where the happy stuff we experience and like, that was great, and we move on. But a lot of the research does show, like, the stronger the emotion, the more it's lodged in the memory. So when you think back to your strongest emotions or your best memories, the most vivid memories, you're going to have like the strong negative ones that were like scary, traumatic, yucky. But you also have like only the super best ones.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's like super happy. Like, I remember all these good feelings. So those get stored more easily than the daily mundane, where there's not a lot of emotion does play a huge part in recollection. So when people are like, oh, the good old days, like, well, and how long ago was that? You know, like, I don't really remember. It seems like yesterday. Yeah, it seems like yesterday. So they're shortening the time span because we don't want to remember how long, we don't want to remember the struggle and the mundane things that took us to get where we are. It just seems like it happened like that. And in our stories, we got to cut to the chase. We don't have time to tell you the 20-year story. We cut to the chase, and then it expressed as it happened overnight.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So would you recommend, how do you recommend people cling to those maybe smaller little things? Like, should they write it down? What would you recommend? Like, just sitting in the little happy moments a little bit more, being a little bit more still?
Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what's wrong with sitting in that a little, and expressing it? I think recording it is a great idea. Like, journaling about the good. Like, I used to be, like, I don't want people to read my journals because that was like where I worked out the problems, right? Like, they're dark because like this is how I was feeling, or this is the situation I couldn't figure out. So it's there where but rarely did I take the time to like write about the wonderful things. And so if you read my history, you'd be like, wow, what a tragic life she had led, you know, because I haven't taken the time, which means I can't relive them as accurately because I didn't record them. So yeah, I would say doing that. Gratitude journals are good things too. recognizing what I do have good in life right this moment, all the wonderful things that I'm experiencing. And mindfulness in general. Mindfulness brings us to a place of equilibrium, right? Because we recognize that the bad is just temporary, and so is the good. And so we realize, like, yeah, typically life is equal for everybody, but those who hold on to, cling to the negative, seems like their life is more tragic. Now, I don't want to downplay, there are people who have tragic lives.
Right, of course.
They have very difficult lives, right? But we also know that there have been people who have been in those tragic lives who still were content. So it is not necessarily the situation that creates the emotion. Now, our bodies will respond physiologically to emotions. So if we feel fear, our heart might start beating faster, right? But when we are mindful and we slow down and we're like, where's this coming from? Then we can decide what feeling we want to attach to that. Because once we realize, like, oh, that's a barking dog, that's a neighbor's dog, that's not a loose dog who's going to get me, right? And then suddenly I'm not feeling anxious about it anymore. But if I'm just like, I hear something coming after me and I'm scared, and I'm just going to sit with that fear because I don't know how to do with it. I'm not taking the time. I'm just going to run. I'm going to run until I feel safe. Well, there are two ways to go about it, but one of them is going to get you to calm a lot faster than the other.
Yeah.
So the mindfulness practice, I think, is a good way.
Okay. Where would someone access that without spending a lot of money on a coach or like I did?
Yeah. There are a lot of free apps, or at least semi-free, like start out semi-free, and you have to buy if you want to get more into it. But like I use a very simple one called Clue. That's not true. That's a different app. You can cut that out.
That's a board game.
There is an app called, but the app that I use is called Oak.
Okay.
And it just has like 6 simple meditations on it. One is an unguided meditation. I actually use that. It's just a timer because I've done that already, that work. I actually offer some beginning mindfulness courses. So I'm starting one on Monday for a small group. Probably online you can find anybody nowadays. I recommend Thomas McConkey's podcast called Mindfulness Plus. I think that's a good start for people who want to learn about mindfulness. He goes a little metaphysical, but it's not too much, I don't think. But he has a lot of training in Eastern practices and cultures that he brings into Western culture, and so that's kind of an interesting way to approach it. There are some what are the mindfulness apps off the top of my head? I can see their apps, but I can't think of the names.
I'm sure a nice Google search would probably lead up to a bunch.
Yeah, a nice Google search. Yeah, you can search anyone, just mindfulness apps, and you'll find like 10. Just go into your app store and find one, and there'll be free ones.
Yeah.
The thing about mindfulness more than anything is consistency in it. If you can just learn stillness, and that can happen in yoga practice. Because some people, it's like too hard to sit by yourself. Well, go to a yoga studio and just listen to her instructions and do the best you can without judgment. Because that's what mindfulness really is, right? Mindfulness is observing ourselves without judgment, observing our thoughts without judgment, observing what's happening without judgment. We're just turning off that thinking part of our brain and really focusing on the observing part of our brain. And so if we can learn just to sit back and observe our own thoughts observe what's happening in the present moment. That will get us to where we can see what's really happening, where it's really coming from, if there's something we can do about it or not. And that's the practice. So if you need movement to really do that, because you seem like a tactile person and you're like, I need that movement, take a yoga class, but a gentle yoga class, right? Not one of these like you're trying to bend into pretzels and you're like it's all about straining yourself and it's 100 degrees, right? Because you want to start off with gentle yoga where you're just doing like some simple stretching, and it's not about the positions. It's about being gentle with yourself and just letting somebody lead you through a little bit of movement where you're taking your mind off of other things and you're just thinking about the present. Tai Chi also does that same thing, less strenuous maybe, to join a Tai Chi group in the community and just go out there and do those gentle movements. It's focusing on the here and now, not thinking about anything else. I think those are great places to start for people who don't know how to do it. Because I'm such a busy mind person, like when I try to do it on my own, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm just going to do like a guided imagery that I read about online. And I couldn't do that because I wanted to create the whole story. Like, no, don't do that. Like, so I couldn't do it. I had a hard time. I needed somebody to guide me through that. So if you need a guided imagery or a guided somebody to tell you, to remind you to let go of that thought and just acknowledge it, thank it, let it go, some of those apps will work. Some of those apps are sufficient, I think, without paying lots of money to a guru. There are lots of books out there too on mindfulness. There's a good one. I guess I'm just Thomas McConaughey's hype man right now. He has a book called At One-ment, and it has questions that guide you through each of the chapters. So you can think about, like, what does this mean to be at one? What does it mean? So that's a little religious tone to it, but it's not a 100% religious book. It's more about finding your true self. Sharon Salzberg is a big mindfulness person. Also, you can read her books. Again, just a Google search. Some of the big names will repeat. They'll show up over and over again. That people who have practiced this for a long time, before it even got popular, they were doing it. So those things. But trying our best. I think for your audience, if it's a lot of church members, they have been doing this, or they've been trying to do this all of their lives, because that's what it means to be in communication with God in prayer, right? So a lot of your prayers should be somewhat meditative, right? If you can find time to just sit with your thoughts and communicate with your higher power, and whether that be in nature, whether that be in your bedside, whether, just that time where you stop and you review the day and you think about self and your connections to everything else in the world, then that's mindfulness.
Yeah, I feel that way at the temple too.
Yeah.
Even just sitting on the ground,
That's exactly what you're doing, is you're meditating in some way. You're being mindful. Like mindfulness and meditation, they're not exactly the same thing, but mindfulness practices often include meditation practices, and prayer and meditation, probably the ones that people are most familiar with, without recognizing it as a mindfulness practice.
Right. Yeah. Would you say that mindfulness, leads to happiness? Or at least a feeling of contentment in life?
I will say that's been my experience. And if the Dalai Lama is any indicator, then yeah. But also all the prophets. Because I would say, I would put President Nelson right up there with the Dalai Lama in daily meditation. Because if President Nelson's not like in deep prayer and meditation with Heavenly Father, who is, right? So, yeah, he seems like he's a pretty happy fellow, right? And so I would say that because what it does lower all your parasympathetic systems are connected to that breathing system. And when we are being mindful, especially if you start off with a breathing mindfulness practice, it has an effect on the brain, on the nervous system. And so doing those practices, the most basic thing they teach you in therapy and in mindfulness and lots of things that they're trying to get people to calm down is to take deep breaths. You know, take deep, full breaths, and that calms you down. And as you calm down, you know, this part back of here, the brain that's going haywire, then this part can come back online. And when that does, then yeah, are you more satisfied? Are you happier? Yes, because you're calm and you can be at peace and you feel safe. Because in the present moment, most of us are safe. Okay, in the present moment, that's precluding all those people in war-torn situations, right? That, like, obviously they're not safe or they're running from bandits and stuff.
Right, of course.
But the majority of us that are not running for our lives at this moment are really safe, right? So I would say mindfulness does lead to, actually, I don't have to just believe that. I know that. I've read research. I've read the research. Yes, mindfulness and self-compassion, which I think are tied together, because the more mindful you can be, the more compassionate you can be to yourself. I think, well, mindfulness teaches you to be less judgmental. And if you're less judgmental of yourself, then that increases your compassion for self, and that will bring you more peace.
Nice. Is there a downside to mindfulness? Or, I mean, I guess you can take anything to any extreme in life, right? But is there any scenario you can think of where I feel like sometimes people weaponize self-compassion a little bit, or maybe use it as an excuse, maybe? Have you noticed that ever?
Okay, I think there's a fine line. There's a fine line between those who are being mindful and those who use the terminology of mindfulness to excuse behaviors.
Okay.
And you'll see that in 12-step programs too. Like 12-step programs, people will use the terminology of that 12-step program to justify their poor behaviors. To say like, oh, well, I'm doing these steps and I'm supposed to, and this is my boundary, which they're actually using as weapons against people rather than taking accountability for their behaviors and their own issues. So I imagine if somebody can use the language of mindfulness to maybe self-promote or self-justify, but I think if you're really being mindful, you probably lose the motivation to do that. Because the mindfulness should bring you back to the true authentic self. And I believe, I just learned this about myself recently. I just found out I'm not a cynic.
Yay, congrats.
Yay! Because I've always thought, I guess I'm a little cynical, because life is, not turned out the way I thought. But I'm still not cynical about it. I still truly believe that most humans are good and most humans are trustworthy and most humans aren't out to hurt others. I also believe that a lot of humans are scared, and it is because of their need to self-protect. That's when they end up hurting others. So if you're truly mindful, I think the more you're sincere about trying to be mindful, the more you will come to your authentic self and recognize that you're safe in the moment. And if you feel safe in the moment, there's no need to lash out in fear.
Mm.
When you recognize that this is a moment, that there are no problems to be solved, these are just experiences to be had, and that all of that combines to your learning and growth for your good, then this too shall pass, and I don't have to fear it, which means I don't have to lash out.
Hmm.
If I'm really mindful, I recognize I have all that I need, and that I don't have to worry about others taking, and I don't have to fear that I won't have because they're taking their part. Therefore, I can be okay knowing that there's no scarcity.
Hmm.
And that all that I need will be there when I need it. So I do think that true mindfulness should bring you peace. I think if you have been trying it, like I did for years, I'm like, I don't know if this mindfulness works because I've been trying. But the thing is, I hadn't been successful. So how do you know when you've been successful? Maybe is your next question. When you feel peace.
Hmm.
Now, the important thing about mindfulness, I always have to remind everybody when I'm doing classes, is that the goal isn't, I heard this actually from a guy named Hawkeye. He was a mindfulness guy. It just escaped me his name. Anyway, Hawkeye something. Anyway, he said on a podcast I was listening to once that the goal isn't to stop the brain from thinking. The practice really is observing and catching yourself every time you're not being mindful. Mm-hmm. That's the practice, mm-hmm. right? So the practice is like, people get frustrated when they're trying to be mindful. They think they have to clear their brains and like, I have no thoughts. And that's how I'm mindful. That's how I'm meditating. Because suddenly, finally, no thoughts. Oh, that's peace. That's not true, and it's impossible to do because your brain is designed to think. And so what the goal is of mindfulness practice is to observe non-judgmentally, to see what's passing in your brain and observe it, wonder about it, appreciate it, accept it, and let go of it. So every time like you're feeling frustrated, recognizing that I'm frustrated. Oh, okay, now that I recognize it, I can let go of that. And that is the practice. Mm. So a lot of people get frustrated because they think they have to do that too much. And like, well, that's the practice. The fact that you're recognizing it, good job, you're being mindful. Because most of us are feeling that anyway, but we're not recognizing it. Mm. Right? If you're feeling anxious, you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling angry, and you're not stopping to find out why or recognizing that you're actually having those feelings, you're not being mindful. Mm. When you take the step back and go, I think I'm feeling frustrated. Why am I feeling frustrated? Where's that coming from? If I'm feeling hungry, I'm not really angry, I'm just hungry. Right? That's the mindfulness practice right there. So it's okay to sit in the struggle with it because that's how you practice it. Mm-hmm. If you didn't have to do it all the time, it wouldn't be a practice.
Right. Yeah. How would you suggest dealing with people who maybe aren't mindful or refuse to practice mindfulness or are unwilling to sit and think about their emotions and process their own emotions? And they maybe take that out on you, or they, project in some way or whatever, Like, do you have any suggestions for dealing with that? Because obviously being like, you need to be more mindful is not helpful, right? Or like, you should go to therapy is not usually received well, right?
Right.
So any suggestions, I guess, being mindfulness with yourself and...
Even in those situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is this a me issue or is this a them issue? Mm-hmm. And if you can recognize like, oh, this is their issue they're projecting on me, how then you know how you've got to propose to yourself then how do I want to proceed. And sometimes that's just like, I don't think they're ready to hear anything I have to say. I'm just going to remove myself from the situation at the moment. And all of that depends on how much emotion they're bringing to the table. I had an experience with a nephew recently. I have a nephew living with me. And we were button heads when he first moved in because I have my ways of doing things. He has his way of doing things. And our communication styles were not syncing. And so I would like ask him to do something and he would agree to it and then it wouldn't get done.
Oh, yeah.
And I was assuming like you said yes, that meant you were going to do it right now. Right?
Yeah.
And he said yes, and his thought was like, you'll trust me to do it when I can, when I get to it. But since we never had that conversation about what it means to say yes, we grew up in different households, so we have different communication expectations. And so it was tense in the house for a few months or so. And then finally I just said to him, like, I think we're miscommunicating. Can we talk about what it is that we expect from this relationship? Like, what do we need from each other? And like, you write down your list of what you expect and what it looks like, what you need and what it looks like, and I'll write my list of what I need and what it looks like. Like, how does it look for me to respond? And that's come together. And so he was like, very excited about that, and he went off and wrote his list, and he said, yeah, let's, in the next morning we can talk about it. So we wrote our list, and the next morning we sat down and expressed like, oh, this is what I need from you, and this is how it looks. I need respect, and this is what respect looks like to me. And he's like, I need you to honor my agency, and that's what it looks like to me. Right? And it was really interesting to hear what that looks like. And once we have done that, it's been a year. And we have a great relationship, and we're very, it's easy to live in our home, and there's no contention. And it was just a matter of clarifying, which I think mindfulness actually helped me to do that. I was practicing mindfulness before he came into my home. And so that helped me to go like, okay, what can I actually do here? Because I cannot control this, adult male.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he's my nephew, but he's still an adult, right? And so I can't tell him how to be. And most parents of adolescents know they can't do that. Like, you can't tell them how to be because they're agentic humans. So we have to honor agency. And so if we really want to honor agency and we want people to honor our agencies, the best thing we can do is communicate what that means to us, what that looks like to us. And our own mindfulness practice might help us understand that. Like, we got to get to the point where we know what our values are. That allows us to create boundaries. And those boundaries then need to be communicated. And when we can do that, relationships can go a lot smoother.
Are you a fan of, of cutting off relationships when those boundaries aren't respected? Or would you encourage working through something first versus just walking away? I mean, obviously not right away, walking away from conflict or discomfort, but...
That's a loaded question, hard to answer, blanket answer to that, because it all depends on, sometimes children don't have the opportunity.
That's true.
Right? If you're in a home where your parents are emotionally abusive and they're crossing all sorts of boundaries, you don't have the opportunity to say, I'm walking away from this relationship. I'm going to go out on my own. Right? They don't have the opportunity to do that. As adults, I think you need to really sit down and align your values. And like, what are the values I have here and what boundaries do I have in place? Have I communicated them clearly? Have those conversations. And if becomes obvious to you that you have clearly, and they've repeated back to you, yes, I understand this is what you want from me, but they repeatedly can't give it to you. Well, then you need to ask yourself, what is the benefit? What are you getting out of this relationship? And if the only thing you're getting out, well, if you're not getting anything, you're just in it because you feel that they need it, you got some codependency issues that maybe you need to go visit a 12-step program to work through, because you're not responsible for other people. You're not responsible for other people's feelings. You're not responsible for other people's actions. And sometimes we make children feel that they are responsible for other people's feelings, right? And it's easy to correct behaviors by saying that, like, oh, look, you made him sad. You made him feel bad about this. But that's our language, our communication styles, because of the faults of our language. We don't have maybe the right words to say, or it takes a lot longer to say what we really mean, and maybe we don't put enough effort and time into explaining, like, look, what you just did here has repercussions. Not that you made them feel bad, you made them feel sad, you made them feel happy, because you can't make other people feel things.
Right. That's a good point.
And so if we remain in relationship because we think, we're going to save that person, or we're trying to save their feelings, we're trying to save them from themselves, that's not healthy for us. And I would strongly suggest that you reevaluate your motives. And I think that's actually probably the answer for all of it. Always reevaluate your motives. If your motives are aligned with your values, then it works in that relationship, good. If your values are not aligned and this relationship is one that seems like it's pulling you away from your values, then it's probably more toxic than you want to admit.
Yeah.
And I use that term toxic loosely because I know, like, we throw that around in pop culture, like everything's like toxic person, a toxic relationship. But if you are in a relationship, of course, one that's abusive, or one that tells you can't feel what you want to feel, and that you can't do or be who you want to be, that, yes, definitely. And if we are going to label relationships as toxic, those would be the ones that are gaslighting you. Those are definitely relationships that I would suggest you walk away from. Yeah, and there are times that you should go away from relationships, but could they never be rekindled? I can't answer that, right? Because I fundamentally do believe people can change. But I don't believe that we need to suffer silently while we hope for them to change. Because there are enough humans in the world, and nobody is so unique that you won't find somebody just as compatible or more. Because you will find someone more compatible. If you're talking a romantic relationship and this person is somewhat emotionally abusive, yes, I will definitely find someone more compatible with me, because abusive is not compatible with me. Right? And so there's no singular characteristic that any one person has that would trump abusive, toxic behaviors. So, I mean, I value relationships, and I think that all of them can be functional if both individuals in the relationship choose to work on it and make it so. But I can't determine for any individual how long they should work at that.
Right.
Because it has to go back to their values and what they really want. I do think mindfulness helps you determine that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, man, thank you so much. This has been I feel like we could just keep going and going forever. It's so cool.
So it's a hot topic right now, it seems like, but maybe I'm just in those circles.
Yeah. No, I think a lot more people are getting wise, and I feel like almost we're going a little bit backwards too, to like trying to be more authentic and trying to be, or at least maybe I hope, maybe I'm
Yeah.
projecting my hopes or something, but to trying to be more self-aware and kinder and things like that. I hope, anyways.
Yeah, and I believe there also we can weaponize those words too, though,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like, well, that's my authentic self. Take it or leave it.
Yeah, that's
I
very true.
don't believe anybody's authentic self is hateful, mean, obnoxious.
Right. I agree.
I think, yeah, and so people can use those in ways that are misleading and that are just justifying poor behaviors.
Yeah.
And who am I get to judge what a poor behavior is? Well, anything that's antisocial, right?
Yeah.
That's a poor behavior because we are actually designed to be in relation. And so anything that is disruptive to a relationship is probably a poor behavior that you should sit with a moment and find out why you're doing it.
So do you think that people who consider themselves introverts or introverted, do you think they're actually antisocial, or
No, not at all.
just want the right people or need the right people to meet their needs, like you talked
It's
about?
it's an energy kind of thing. I mean, I would say I'm an introvert. And I always kind of knew that, but COVID really made that really obvious to me because I'm like, life is good. I had no
Thriving.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, me and my niece, we lived together and that was it. And I was like, well, I'm happy here, right?
Yeah.
Just I have one person to talk to and that's all I really needed.
Yeah.
Because I don't really thrive in large groups.
Yeah.
I'd rather have a nice, meaningful one-on-one conversation. Like, this is great to sit and talk to you,
Yeah.
right? If I were like in a big crowd teaching actually sometimes is very taxing to me.
Really?
To like talk to this many students at once. I'm grateful that I only have to teach 2 classes a day. I couldn't do that. I could not be a high school teacher and like have people demand of me 8 hours of the day.
Right.
I just couldn't do it. And so I would say I'm an introvert. Does that mean I don't like people? Not at all. I love people. I need to be with people, but not all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I have great relationships. I have long-term, I've got friends from my freshman year of high school
Wow.
and freshman year of college that I'm still really close with. So just because I'm an introvert doesn't mean that I don't like people and I'm anti-relationship. And I don't have any antisocial behaviors. Antisocial people are not necessarily introverts either.
Ooh, that's a good point.
Right? I mean, because they want the crowd, they want the approval, they want the thing, right? And so I'm doing it for antisocial reasons. I'm doing an antisocial behavior for social reasons, right? I'm doing it for the attention. I'm doing it for the praise. I'm doing it for the perceived glory and fame that might come with
Yeah.
it.
Which is maybe what social media is doing too. And
Yeah, maybe giving somebody a platform to do antisocial behaviors.
yeah.
Right?
And then reinforcing that behavior, I guess.
Yeah. To do any kind of hate crime and record that is definitely antisocial.
Right.
Right? But they're doing it maybe for the praise of that group, the in-group that they're in with.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a social act with antisocial means.
Yeah. Well, wow, this is awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Is there any last words of wisdom you would like to tell anyone, young adults, teachers, children? Any last words of wisdom that you'd like to say?
I just want them all to know that I think, well, here I'm about to think my feelings. I want them all to know that they are loved, I think that all need to hear that, and that their emotions, they have every right to feel all the emotions that they feel. Like, I truly believe emotions are gifts from God. We know that Christ himself felt the gamut of emotions, from grief to anger to love to all of them. He felt all of the range of emotions. And so we should never be ashamed of having any of those emotions too. Mm-hmm. Because if our Heavenly Father has those emotions, if our Christ and Savior has those emotions, then obviously they're legitimate. And we should be okay with that. Like, be okay, own those emotions, just figure out like what they are leading us to do, and be mindful about what you do to resolve them, or to actually just sit with them. Mm. And they'll pass. Most of them will pass. I think that people need to be aware of that. Like, you feel down today, it will pass. It's like the weather. Like, they will pass. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it takes longer for them to pass, but the clouds eventually pass. Yes, there are times maybe you need a little help with a therapist or maybe some medication if you get stuck. But it takes, that's like a month worth of stuck.
Yeah.
Then maybe go see somebody. But everybody feels sad. Everybody feels grief. Everybody feels, anger. Everybody feels frustration. Everybody also feels love. Everybody also feels joy. Everybody also feels, excitement. So just enjoy the emotions as they come. Like, sit with them, love them, own them, because that is your authentic self.
Awesome, which came full circle there. I love it. It's so great. Well, thank you so much. Is there anywhere people can reach you, or anywhere that you would like to plug? You've plugged for Thomas McConkey a lot.
Yeah, well, I here at Brigham Young University, I'm in teacher education, the Department of Teacher Education. I do offer mindfulness, intro to mindfulness. I was trained through, they just changed the name of the organization. It's called Mindfulness Institute for Emerging Adults, MIEA. So you can find them online if you're an adolescent or an emerging adult. They really focus on college age students, and so they have programs to help them become more mindful now in their younger years, before it's harder to change the older you get. Yeah. So that's I can be reached for that. If they're interested in doing mindfulness practice, I'd be happy to meet with a small group and teach some introduction to mindfulness practices. My contact information is easy to find because I'm on BYU website, so you can always just reach me through that. I think that's probably the best. My information's all on there. It's just Melissa_Newberry at byu.edu. And I'm here all the time.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week, and I hope you enjoyed this very insightful discussion. I feel so inspired and enriched. It's so fun. So thank you so much, Melissa, and I will see you guys next week.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Remember to tune in every Wednesday for Well-Rounded Wednesday, and please leave a rating and a review.